She was just an elderly woman, quietly settling into her first-class seat, expecting nothing more than a peaceful flight. But within minutes, a flight attendant loomed over her, her eyes cold, her voice sharp. "You need to move. First class isn't for you." The woman hesitated, confusion flickering in her eyes. She reached for her ticket, solid proof that she belonged there. But the attendant didn't even glance at it. She didn't listen. And 5 minutes later, it wasn't the elderly woman who was being removed. It was the flight attendant. What happened in those brief moments turned an ordinary flight into a national scandal. And by the time the plane landed, one career was over, for good. Margaret Lane gripped the handle of her small suitcase, her fingers pressing gently into the worn leather as she stepped into the bustling airport terminal. The soft hum of conversations, the rhythmic rolling of luggage wheels against polished floors, and the distant crackle of announcements filled the air. A retired schoolteacher in her late 70s, Margaret had traveled plenty of times before. But today felt different. Maybe it was the anticipation of reuniting with her granddaughter Sophia after so many years, or maybe it was simply the weight of time settling into her bones. Either way, she was eager to board her flight and finally rest in the seat she had paid for. She approached the check-in counter and handed her ticket to the agent, a young woman with a polite but hurried expression. The agent scanned it, nodded, and offered a quick smile. "You're all set, Miss Lane. First-class boarding will begin soon. Enjoy your flight." A quiet sense of pride settled in Margaret's chest as she tucked the ticket back into her purse. First class. It wasn't something she indulged in often, but this trip was special. She wanted to be comfortable. For years, she had worked tirelessly, saving, providing, ensuring her family had everything they needed. Now, in the later years of her life, she allowed herself small luxuries. And this was one of them. The waiting area filled up quickly as passengers arrived, some chatting in hushed tones, others glued to their phones. She adjusted the strap of her purse on her shoulder and kept her gaze on the boarding gate, waiting. Minutes passed before an announcement echoed through the speakers. "Passengers flying first class on Flight 719 to Denver, you may now begin boarding." Margaret stood, gripping the handle of her suitcase, and made her way to the front. A few other first-class passengers stepped forward as well. A group of businessmen in sleek suits, a young couple whispering to each other. A woman wearing oversized sunglasses as she scrolled through her phone. No one paid her any attention, and that was fine with her. She handed her ticket to the gate agent, who scanned it before gesturing toward the jet bridge. As she walked down the narrow passage, the familiar rush of cool air from the plane's entrance washed over her. At the door stood a flight attendant, greeting passengers with a practiced smile. Vanessa Reed had been a flight attendant for almost a decade. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who believed they ran the cabin. Her nods were polite but distant, her expression neutral as the first few passengers entered. Margaret stepped inside, walking toward her seat in the first-class cabin. She placed her purse down and carefully tucked her suitcase into the overhead compartment. The seat was soft, wide, and inviting. She sank into it with a quiet sigh of relief. The past few days had been exhausting, but now she could finally relax. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small photograph, a picture of Sophia, back when she was just a little girl, standing outside her childhood home. Margaret traced the edges of the photo with her thumb before carefully tucking it away. But just as she settled in, a sharp voice cut through the quiet hum of the cabin. "Excuse me, ma'am, I think you're in the wrong seat." Margaret looked up, startled. Standing beside her was Vanessa, arms crossed, a slight frown on her face. The flight attendant's uniform was crisp, her hair pulled back into a flawless bun, her name tag gleaming under the overhead lights. Margaret blinked, then reached for her ticket, her expression calm. "I believe this is my seat." Vanessa didn't even glance at the ticket before shaking her head. "First class is reserved for paying passengers. Are you sure you didn't mean to sit in the main cabin?" For a moment, Margaret thought she had misheard. But then she saw it. The way Vanessa's eyes flickered over her. The hesitation in her stance. The unspoken message in her tone. This wasn't about a mistake. Her fingers tightened around the small piece of paper in her hands. "This is my assigned seat," she said evenly. Vanessa let out a small, impatient sigh. A few nearby passengers had turned to look, some curious, others pretending not to hear. The flight attendant leaned in slightly, lowering her voice but keeping the authority in her tone. "Let's not make this difficult. I can help you find your real seat." Margaret exhaled slowly. She had been polite. She had followed every rule. Yet here she was, being asked to leave a place she rightfully belonged. She straightened her shoulders, her voice steady. "I won't be moving. I have my ticket, and this is where I'm supposed to sit." Vanessa's expression stiffened. She clearly hadn't expected resistance. After a brief pause, she adjusted her uniform and spoke curtly. "I'll be right back." With that, she turned on her heel and strode toward the front of the plane. Margaret remained seated, her fingers resting lightly on the armrest, but inside, her thoughts were anything but calm. She could feel it, the weight of every gaze, the silent judgment. Passengers were watching, waiting to see what would happen next. She had done nothing wrong, but somehow she already knew this wasn't over. Vanessa's voice remained firm, her posture stiff. "Let's not make this difficult. I can help you find your real seat." A slow burn settled deep in Margaret's chest. She had been polite. She had followed every rule, and yet, here she was, being told she didn't belong. She exhaled slowly, steadying her voice. "I won't be moving. I have my ticket, and this is where I'm supposed to sit." Vanessa's expression tightened. She clearly hadn't expected resistance. Adjusting her uniform, she pressed her lips into a thin line. "I'll be right back," she said curtly before turning on her heel and striding toward the front of the plane. Margaret remained seated, her fingers resting on the armrest. Her face was calm, but inside, her thoughts churned. Around her, the quiet murmur of the cabin had shifted. The energy felt different now. Passengers who had been lost in their books or devices were suddenly aware. She could feel their eyes. Some watching in silent curiosity, others quickly looking away, unwilling to get involved. It was always the same. People saw. People knew. But no one ever spoke up. Vanessa marched toward the front of the plane, her heels clicking sharply against the carpet. She pushed past a fellow flight attendant, Tyler Quinn, who had been checking the galley supplies. He frowned, noticing her tense expression. "Everything okay?" Tyler adjusted his tie, his tone casual but observant. Vanessa let out an exasperated breath. "There's a woman in first class who shouldn't be there. I told her to move, but she's refusing." Tyler's brows furrowed slightly. He glanced over Vanessa's shoulder, his eyes landing on Margaret, still sitting calmly in her seat. "Did you check her ticket?" Vanessa rolled her eyes. "I don't need to check it. I know a mistake when I see one. She probably switched seats with someone. Or maybe she belonged there." The voice that cut through the conversation wasn't Tyler's. It was deeper, more authoritative. Captain Michael Hayes had stepped out of the cockpit. His sharp blue eyes settled on Vanessa with quiet scrutiny. Vanessa stiffened at his presence but quickly masked it with a professional stance. "Sir, I believe there's been an issue with seating," she started. The captain tilted his head slightly. "You mean Mrs. Lane?" Vanessa blinked. "You know her?" Captain Hayes gave a slow nod, his expression unreadable. "I've flown her before, more than once. She's a respected customer." Tyler let out a quiet breath, crossing his arms. "Sounds like her ticket is legit then." Vanessa's fingers twitched slightly. I still need to confirm. I don't want passengers getting the wrong idea." Captain Hayes' gaze hardened. "The only wrong idea here is making a passenger feel like they don't belong." For the first time, Vanessa felt a flicker of unease. She was used to being in control, used to making quick decisions and moving on. But now, under the weight of the captain's stare, she could feel something slipping. Still, she forced a polite nod. "Understood, sir. I'll handle it." Without waiting for further discussion, she turned and made her way back toward first class. But this time, her steps weren't as confident. Margaret hadn't moved an inch when Vanessa returned. The older woman simply looked up, waiting. Vanessa inhaled sharply, keeping her voice steady, though the authority in it felt forced. "I'm going to need to see your boarding pass." Margaret didn't hesitate. She reached into her purse, pulled out the crisp ticket, and handed it over without a word. Vanessa scanned the details, her throat tightening. Seat 3A. First class confirmed. She had been wrong. The realization settled in her stomach like a heavy stone. But she didn't let it show. Instead, she forced a tight smile and handed the ticket back. "Thank you, just making sure everything is in order." Margaret accepted it, slipping it back into her purse. Her gaze remained steady, her face calm. But in her eyes, there was something else. Something that told Vanessa she knew exactly what had just happened. Vanessa turned stiffly and walked away, her cheeks burning. But as she moved back toward the front of the plane, she failed to notice the young woman sitting across the aisle. Isabel Cruz had been watching the entire exchange, and she had recorded every second of it. She lowered her phone slightly, her heart pounding. She had seen things like this before, small, quiet moments where someone was treated unfairly, dismissed, questioned, all because they didn't fit someone's idea of who belonged where. But this time, it wasn't just a fleeting moment. It was happening right in front of her. And she had the proof in her hands. Isabel Cruz glanced toward Margaret, who sat composed and steady, but something about the way her hands rested gently on her lap told Isabel this wasn't new to her. The quiet patience, the way she didn't react with anger or protest. No, Margaret had been through this before, and that realization made Isabel's stomach tighten. She turned toward the front of the plane, where Vanessa had disappeared, likely thinking she could brush the whole thing off. Isabel clenched her jaw, her fingers tightening around her phone. If the flight attendant thought she could treat someone like that and move on as if nothing had happened, she was wrong. Up front, Vanessa stepped into the galley, pressing a hand against her forehead. She hadn't expected to be corrected. Not by the captain, not by Tyler. It made her chest tighten. For years, she had worked in first class, handling high-profile passengers, making sure everything ran smoothly. This was her domain, her authority. And yet, in just a few minutes, that old woman had made her look incompetent. She needed to regain control. Straightening her uniform, she stepped back into the cabin, scanning the rows. Most of the passengers had returned to their books or devices, their attention drifting elsewhere. Good. By the time they were in the air, this would all be forgotten. But then, out of the corner of her eye, she caught movement. Isabel was tapping her phone screen. Vanessa frowned, stepping forward. "Excuse me, ma'am, what are you doing?" Isabel barely glanced up. "Just checking my messages." Vanessa narrowed her eyes. "I'd appreciate it if passengers didn't record crew members during flight preparations." This time, Isabel met her gaze fully, her expression unreadable. "Oh? I thought airlines encouraged passengers to document their experiences." Vanessa's stomach flipped. There was something deliberate about Isabel's words, something that made her uneasy. Isabel leaned back in her seat, casually adjusting her phone in her grip. "I guess it's only a problem when the experience doesn't look good, huh?" Vanessa clenched her jaw. "Just focus on getting ready for takeoff, ma'am." She turned and walked away, trying to shake the discomfort crawling up her spine. But as she stepped back into the galley, she reached for her own phone, quickly opening the airline's customer feedback page. Her breath caught. A video, just a few seconds long, had already been uploaded. The title made her stomach drop. The view count was climbing by the second. Her fingers tightened around her phone as she scrolled through the comments. Some were asking for details. Others were already condemning what had happened. "What's going on?" Tyler's voice cut through her thoughts. She looked up sharply. He had just finished checking the last of the passengers and had returned to the galley, catching the troubled look on her face. She quickly locked her screen, forcing a neutral expression. "Nothing, just checking something." Tyler raised an eyebrow, unconvinced. "You sure? You look like you just saw a ghost." Vanessa exhaled sharply. "It's fine, let's just get this flight in the air." But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't fine. She had been in this job long enough to know how fast a bad passenger experience could spiral out of control. And if this video kept spreading, it wouldn't just be a conversation between her and the captain anymore. The corporate office would get involved. And if there was one thing Vanessa couldn't afford right now, it was bad attention from the higher-ups. Back in first class, Isabel watched Vanessa disappear again before turning her phone screen toward Margaret. "Excuse me, ma'am, I just wanted to check in. Are you okay?" Margaret turned to her, offering a soft smile, though there was something guarded in her eyes. "Oh, I'm fine, sweetheart, but thank you for asking." Isabel hesitated before speaking again. "I saw what happened. It wasn't right. Margaret sighed, her fingers smoothing over the fabric of her dress. It never is, but people like me, we learn how to handle it. We don't always get to argue. Sometimes it's easier to let things go. Isabel's jaw tightened. That's the problem, though. You shouldn't have to handle it. You shouldn't have to prove you belong. Margaret gave Isabel a knowing look. One filled with years of quiet battles, of moments just like this one that had come and gone. That's the way the world is, dear, but that doesn't mean people don't change. Isabel sat back, feeling the weight of those words. She admired Margaret's patience, but she wasn't sure she could match it. Because as she refreshed her phone, she saw the video had now been shared by an airline watchdog account. And within minutes, this situation would no longer be under Vanessa's control. Vanessa's stomach twisted as she shoved her phone back into her pocket. The view count was climbing, but she needed to focus. The plane hadn't even taken off yet, and she couldn't afford to let this spiral any further. If she kept her head down, did her job, and acted like nothing had happened, maybe, just maybe, this would blow over. Straightening her uniform, she stepped back into the first-class cabin, determined to act as if everything was normal. But the moment she did, she felt the shift. Passengers had turned slightly in their seats, their gazes subtle but expectant. They weren't speaking, they weren't protesting, but the weight of their silent judgment pressed against her, thick as the cabin air. Margaret sat still, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. She wasn't sulking. She wasn't causing a scene. And yet, her presence alone carried a quiet strength that made Vanessa feel unsettled. She swallowed hard. From the corner of her eye, Isabel caught her gaze and gave her a slow, knowing look. A silent message. This isn't over. Vanessa ignored it, clearing her throat as she moved to check on another passenger. But just as she turned, a new voice entered the mix. "Excuse me, miss." Vanessa paused. An older man sitting a row ahead had leaned slightly into the aisle. William Carter. A distinguished-looking gentleman in his 60s. He had the air of someone who had spent a lifetime in business, someone who had seen power shift from one person to another more times than he could count. Vanessa forced a polite smile. "Yes, sir?" William gestured toward Margaret without directly looking at her. "I happened to overhear what happened earlier. I was wondering, was there an issue with this lady's ticket?" Vanessa felt her spine stiffen. "No, sir. Everything has been sorted." William nodded slowly, tapping his fingers against the armrest. "I see. It's just, I fly first class all the time, and I don't recall ever seeing anyone else get questioned like that." A flicker of heat rose to Vanessa's face. "Sir, we check tickets when necessary to ensure passenger comfort and security." William raised an eyebrow, his tone cool. "I don't doubt that. I was just wondering if it was necessary this time." The air in the cabin grew heavier. Vanessa clenched her jaw, forcing another polite smile. "Sir, if you have any concerns about airline policies, I encourage you to file a report with customer service." William gave a slight chuckle, shaking his head. "No need for that. Seems like the internet is handling it already." Vanessa's breath caught for a split second, but she kept her face composed. "Please let me know if you need anything else, sir." She turned quickly, walking toward the galley before she could hear any more comments. Her skin burned as she gripped the counter, breathing deeply. The weight of it all was pressing down on her now. The video, the whispers, the fact that the passengers weren't just forgetting about this. And then, her worst fear came true. The in-flight phone rang. Vanessa stared at it, her stomach twisting into knots. No one called the crew line before takeoff unless it was urgent. Slowly she picked it up. "This is Vanessa Reed speaking." A deep voice on the other end made her blood run cold. "This is Robert Whitmore from Airline Corporate Relations. We need to have a conversation about the incident on board." Vanessa swallowed hard, gripping the phone tightly. The voice on the other end was calm but firm, the kind of tone that left no room for excuses. "Miss Reed, we've received multiple reports about a situation involving a first-class passenger. Can you confirm what happened?" Robert Whitmore's voice carried the weight of authority. Vanessa knew that whatever she said next would be scrutinized. Her mind raced. She could try to downplay it, make it sound like a minor misunderstanding, but she had already seen the video spreading online. Corporate had clearly seen it too. She cleared her throat, keeping her voice steady. There was a brief issue with a seating confirmation, but it's been resolved. A pause. That's not what we're seeing. Vanessa felt the heat rise to her neck. Sir, I was simply ensuring that all passengers were properly seated according to airline policy. There was another pause, this one longer. Then Robert's voice came through, colder than before. And by doing that, you singled out an elderly woman in front of the entire first-class cabin. Vanessa's breath hitched. The way he said it, direct, factual, without sugarcoating, made it hit harder than she expected. Vanessa's breath hitched. The way he said it, direct, factual, without sugarcoating, made it hit harder than she expected. Miss Reed, Robert Whitmore continued, his tone sharp. Do you understand the severity of this situation? Vanessa swallowed, gripping the counter. Sir, I was only doing my job. There was a pause. Then his voice turned colder. That's exactly the problem. If this is how you believe your job should be done, then we have a serious issue. The words landed like a slap. Effective immediately, you are to be relieved of duty for the remainder of this flight. Vanessa's stomach dropped. What? You will remain on board as a passenger, but you are no longer authorized to act in any capacity as a crew member. Her heart pounded in her chest. Sir, please, This is not up for discussion, he cut her off. Captain Hayes has already been notified. You will comply. The call ended with a sharp click. Vanessa stood frozen, the phone still pressed to her ear, even though the line had gone dead. This couldn't be happening. She had worked for this airline for years, built a reputation, and now, because of one passenger, one moment, she was being stripped of her authority. In front of everyone. She turned her head slowly and caught Tyler watching her from across the galley. His expression was unreadable, but there was no sympathy in his eyes. He had heard everything. Before she could say a word, the intercom crackled to life. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Hayes. We will be departing shortly. Flight attendants, please secure the cabin for takeoff. Tyler stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. I'll take over from here, Vanessa. You should find yourself a seat. Her throat tightened. Tyler, it's done. And just like that, Vanessa Reed was no longer in control. Vanessa stood gripping the edge of the galley counter as the reality of the situation sank in. The airline had stripped her of her authority, mid-flight. She had been humiliated in front of her own crew, and now she had no choice but to sit among the very passengers who had just watched her fail. Tyler gave her a pointed look. I suggest you take your seat before the captain asks why you're still standing. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, to insist this was all being blown out of proportion, but the weight of the moment held her back. She wasn't in charge anymore. She wasn't the one making the rules. Without another word, she turned and walked stiffly toward the first-class cabin. The moment she stepped into the aisle, she felt it, the shift, the stares. They weren't loud, no one spoke, no one pointed. But the silence itself was deafening. It was a shift in power she had never felt before, one she had spent her entire career making sure she never experienced. She kept her eyes forward, moving quickly, her breath shallow. But then, as she passed by Margaret, the older woman glanced up and met her gaze. There was no smugness in her expression, no gloating, no satisfaction, just quiet observation. Vanessa clenched her jaw and kept walking. But her pulse was erratic. She felt the stares from Isabel, from William, from passengers who had witnessed the entire ordeal. She reached an empty seat near the front of the economy section, slid into it, and stared out the window. For the first time since she had put on her uniform all those years ago, she felt small. Tyler walked up to Margaret's seat, his demeanor calm and professional. Mrs. Lane, I just want to personally apologize for what happened earlier. It was unacceptable. Margaret gave a small smile. That's very kind of you, young man. But I've been on this earth long enough to know that words are easy. She held his gaze. Actions are harder. Tyler nodded, understanding the weight of her words. I can promise you this. What happened won't be ignored. From across the cabin, Isabel still held her phone, looking between them before speaking up. It already isn't. Tyler turned slightly, catching a glimpse of her screen. The video had skyrocketed in views. Thousands of comments, retweets, news outlets already picking up the story. Isabel smirked. Seems like the world is watching. Margaret simply exhaled, glancing toward the front of the plane, where Vanessa sat stiffly in her seat. The flight had barely begun, But for Vanessa Reed, the turbulence had already started. There was a different kind of tension in the air now, one that had nothing to do with turbulence. Vanessa sank into her economy seat, feeling the weight of it settle deep in her chest. This was never supposed to happen. She had always been the one with authority, the one in control, the one passengers were expected to respect. But now, she was just another passenger. She could feel the stares, the way first-class passengers whispered among themselves. The occasional glances from economy as people discreetly checked their phones. The video was spreading, and she was at the center of it. She folded her arms tightly, keeping her eyes fixed on the seat back in front of her. If she could just make it through this flight, maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to salvage this before it completely destroyed her career. But deep down, she already knew. The damage had been done. Isabel refreshed her feed and nearly laughed under her breath. The video had now been picked up by multiple social media pages, and some airline watchdog accounts had already started tagging the company's official page, demanding a response. She turned her phone slightly toward Margaret. "You're famous, Mrs. Lane." Margaret chuckled softly, shaking her head. "Famous isn't what I was looking for. I just wanted to sit in the seat I paid for." Isabel nodded, understanding completely. "Well, the internet has other plans. People are angry. The airline's going to have to respond soon." Just as she said it, Tyler approached again, kneeling slightly so he was at Margaret's level. His voice was low but sincere. "Mrs. Lane, I just wanted to check if there's anything we can do to make this flight more comfortable for you. A meal, a drink, anything at all?" Margaret studied him for a moment before offering a small smile. "I appreciate it, young man, but I don't need special treatment. I just wanted to be treated like everyone else." Tyler nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling deep in his chest. He had seen unfair situations play out before. Passengers ignored, assumptions made. But rarely had he seen the tables turn so quickly. Before he could respond, the overhead speaker crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Hayes speaking. We've now reached our cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. We expect a smooth flight today with minimal turbulence. In the meantime, please sit back, relax, and enjoy your journey." Tyler sighed, knowing there was still work to do. He gave Margaret a polite nod before heading back to the galley. As he did, Isabel smirked. "I bet Vanessa isn't relaxing right now." Margaret's lips twitched slightly. "I expect she's learning something, though." Vanessa stared blankly ahead, her hands gripping the seatbelt strap. The first few minutes had been bad enough. But now, she felt completely exposed. The uniform that once gave her authority now felt like a heavy burden pressing down on her. Then, a sudden voice caught her off guard. "Excuse me, miss?" She turned sharply. A man in the seat beside her, a father with a young daughter resting against his arm, was looking at her with hesitant curiosity, almost apologetic. But his words cut deeper than he intended. "Aren't you supposed to be working up front?" A fresh wave of embarrassment crashed over her. She forced a tight smile, shaking her head. "I was reassigned." The man gave an awkward nod, sensing the tension, and quickly turned back to his daughter. Vanessa exhaled slowly, her grip on her seat tightening. This was going to be the longest flight of her life. Robert Whitmore sat at his desk, reading through the growing number of reports coming in. He had already watched the video, twice, and each time, his expression had darkened. He turned to his assistant. "Has the PR team drafted a response?" The assistant nodded. "They're working on it now. But honestly, sir, this isn't just an online issue anymore." Robert's jaw clenched. "What do you mean?" The assistant hesitated before adding, "We've got customers calling in. People are threatening to boycott." Then, a pause. "And we just got a direct complaint from a VIP member, the one involved in the incident." Robert rubbed his temples. "You mean Mrs. Lane?" She nodded. "She didn't make a big scene. Just asked for clarification on why she was singled out." Robert sighed. But considering her loyalty to the airline, they had a much bigger problem on their hands. "This is bad." Robert Whitmore muttered the words under his breath as he scrolled through his phone, searching his internal contacts. He didn't hesitate when he found the name he was looking for. With a deep breath, he pressed the call button. Because now, this wasn't just Vanessa's problem anymore. This was about to go all the way to the top. Vanessa shifted in her seat, her breath uneven as the reality of her situation settled deeper. The uniform she had once worn with pride now felt like a heavy burden. She could still hear the murmurs around her, the subtle glances passengers gave her when they thought she wasn't looking. She wasn't used to this feeling. Being observed, being judged. She had always been the one with authority, the one giving instructions, the one people were supposed to listen to. Now, she was just another passenger. And she hated it. She folded her arms, gripping them tightly, her eyes locked on the seatback in front of her. Up in first class, Tyler had taken over her responsibilities, moving effortlessly through the cabin, checking on passengers with ease. It stung. She had been the one who ran things here. The one who made sure every detail was in order. But now someone else had stepped in, without hesitation, without struggle. And it was as if she had never been needed at all. She turned away, exhaling sharply. She just needed to get through this flight. She'd find a way to fix this, to explain things when they landed. Maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to salvage her career. Then, her phone vibrated in her pocket. She hesitated, then pulled it out, her stomach clenching when she saw the notification at the top of the screen. Her breath hitched. She tapped the article, her eyes skimming through the text. A video circulating on social media shows a flight attendant questioning an elderly woman's seat in first class, despite her having a valid ticket. The flight attendant has since been removed from duty mid-flight, and sources say airline executives are now involved. Customers have already begun calling for an investigation. She scrolled down to the comment section, and her throat tightened. This is exactly why we need accountability in air travel. This woman has probably flown more times than that flight attendant has even worked. Disgusting. The fact that they pulled the FA from duty mid-flight means they know she was in the wrong. Vanessa clenched the phone in her hand, a bitter taste filling her mouth. It wasn't just spreading. It was exploding. She scrolled further, her pulse pounding as she saw the airline's official account receiving thousands of mentions from angry customers. And then, her stomach dropped. A statement had been released. She read the words slowly, each one tightening the grip around her throat. We take all customer concerns seriously. The incident involving a first-class passenger on Flight 719 is under immediate review. The crew member in question has been placed on leave, pending further investigation. Our airline remains committed to ensuring all passengers are treated with dignity and respect. Her heart pounded. Placed on leave. That meant they weren't just planning to talk to her when she landed. They were already making moves to remove her completely. She glanced around, suddenly feeling like the walls of the plane were closing in. She had seen other employees get fired before, sometimes over the smallest mistakes, sometimes over incidents that weren't even their fault. But this was different. Because there was video proof. And once the public got involved, the airline wouldn't hesitate to cut her loose to protect its image. She could feel her pulse in her ears as panic clawed its way up her throat. She turned her phone off, shoving it deep into her pocket, as if that would somehow make all of this disappear. But it wouldn't. Margaret sat quietly, her hands resting on her lap. The plane was peaceful now. But there was an undeniable tension lingering in the air. She could feel it. The way some passengers avoided eye contact with her. The way others gave her quiet nods of acknowledgement. She wasn't sure how to feel. She had spent a lifetime experiencing moments like this. Some subtle, some blatant, all of them exhausting in their own way. But never had one played out so publicly. Never had the consequences come this quickly. Across from her, Isabel tapped on her phone before glancing up. Looks like corporate finally responded. Margaret raised an eyebrow. What did they say? Isabel smirked. They're investigating. She made air quotes with her fingers, which basically means they're already preparing to fire her. Margaret inhaled slowly. I don't want anyone to lose their job over this. Isabel scoffed. Mrs. Lane, she was ready to throw you off this plane like you didn't belong. Margaret was quiet for a moment, then sighed. That may be true, but people only change when they're given the chance to. Margaret tilted her head slightly, considering Isabel's words. Because people only change when they're given the chance to. Isabel hesitated. And if she doesn't change? Margaret gave a knowing smile. Then, she won't be getting back on another plane, will she? Isabel sighed, leaning back. You're too patient, Mrs. Lane. Margaret chuckled softly. It's not patience, dear. It's just knowing that the world will handle things how it sees fit. She looked toward the front of the plane, where Vanessa sat motionless, her hands clenched in her lap. Margaret had no doubt the woman was struggling, likely fearing for her career, possibly even regretting her actions. But regret meant nothing if it didn't turn into change. As the plane continued through the sky, the world below them was already shifting. And soon, Vanessa Reed would have to decide which way she was going to fall. The low hum of the engines filled the cabin. But for Vanessa, it might as well have been silence. The weight in her chest felt suffocating, like someone had tightened an invisible grip around her throat. She shifted in her seat, her hands clenched into fists in her lap. No matter how much she tried to steady herself, the reality remained the same. Her career, everything she had worked for, was hanging by a thread. She stole a glance toward first class, but the curtain separating the cabins had already been drawn. She was cut off from the section she had once controlled, from the passengers who had been under her care just an hour ago. Now, she sat among the very people she had always dismissed as background noise. The travelers who shuffled past her while boarding, the ones she rarely paid attention to unless they needed something. And now, she was one of them. Her pulse jumped when she heard the unmistakable sound of a flight attendant approaching. Her body stiffened. She expected Tyler to return, to humiliate her further. But instead, it was Rachel Bennett, one of the attendants working in economy. Rachel had always been friendly, soft-spoken, efficient, but when she stopped next to Vanessa's seat, there was something unreadable in her expression. "Would you like something to drink?" she asked simply. Vanessa blinked. She wasn't expecting that. She hesitated, her throat dry. "Water, please." Rachel gave a small nod and handed her a plastic cup. Then she lingered for a second. "Rough day?" Vanessa nearly scoffed at the understatement, but she swallowed it down. She didn't need pity. She didn't need kindness. What she needed was a way to fix this, before it was too late. "Something like that," she muttered, gripping the cup too tightly. Rachel tilted her head slightly, as if debating something. Finally, she spoke. "People are talking about it, you know?" Vanessa's stomach twisted. "I figured." Rachel nodded toward a few passengers who were casually scrolling through their phones. "Some of them already know your name. You might want to prepare yourself when we land." Vanessa's throat tightened. Rachel studied her for another moment before stepping back. "If you need anything, let me know." And just like that, she was gone. Vanessa stared at the untouched water in her hands. Prepare herself for what she already knew was coming. The moment they landed, she'd be met at the gate by management, maybe even security. She'd be pulled into an office, asked to explain herself, forced to sit through an uncomfortable meeting where she'd try to justify why she had questioned Margaret's seat without proper verification. And then, they'd fire her. She knew it. It didn't matter that she had worked for the airline for nearly 10 years. It didn't matter that she had followed policies her entire career. It didn't matter that she had always been strict with first-class passengers. None of it mattered now, because the world had seen what she had done. And the airline, they would never choose to defend her over protecting their image. She exhaled sharply, finally taking a small sip of water. But it did nothing to soothe the burning in her throat. Isabel refreshed her phone, watching as more and more people flooded the airline's page with comments. She smirked as she turned to Margaret. "Looks like you're a trending topic, Mrs. Lane." Margaret sighed. "Is that supposed to make me feel better?" Isabel grinned. "Maybe not. But it's proof that people are paying attention." Margaret folded her hands in her lap, watching as Tyler moved through the cabin, handling service as if nothing had happened. That was the thing about moments like these. People moved on quickly. The world would keep spinning. The airline would make a statement. The news cycle would eventually shift to something else. But Vanessa Reed? She would carry this forever. Isabel scrolled through the comments, her eyes skimming over post after post. Fire her immediately. She didn't even check the ticket before assuming. This is why airlines need better training. Unacceptable. Isabel exhaled. The internet doesn't forget. Margaret sighed softly. No, it doesn't. And neither would Vanessa. because once the wheels touched the ground, the fallout would truly begin. Isabel scrolled through her phone, her smirk fading slightly as she read something new. "Well, this is interesting." Margaret glanced at her. "What is?" Isabel turned her phone slightly, letting Margaret see the post. "Someone just posted a follow-up. The airline hasn't just placed Vanessa on leave," she tapped the screen. "They're already pulling flight records to see if she's done this before." Margaret's eyebrows lifted slightly. "So they're digging deeper." Isabel nodded. "Looks like it. If this isn't the first time she's acted like this, she's done for." Margaret exhaled slowly. She wasn't sure how she felt about that. Isabel, however, had no such reservations. Karma's fast today. Vanessa's phone vibrated again. She hesitated before pulling it out. Another notification. But this one wasn't from social media. It was from her personal email. Her breath caught when she saw the subject line. Her stomach turned as she opened it. She read the words and felt her fate seal itself in place. "Miss Reed, this email serves as an official notification that you are now under formal review by the airline's compliance board. Effective immediately, you are suspended from all flight duties pending further investigation. A meeting has been scheduled upon landing to discuss next steps. You are required to report to management upon arrival at the gate. Failure to comply may result in termination." Her hands trembled slightly as she read the words again. Suspended. She wasn't just removed from this flight, she was officially being pushed out. Her chest tightened as she realized how fast everything had crumbled. This morning, she had been a senior flight attendant, moving through her routine like she always had, and now she was watching her entire career slip through her fingers. She turned off her phone and let her head fall back against the seat, staring at the ceiling. For the first time since the flight began, she felt something she wasn't used to. Powerless. The word suspended echoed in her mind, louder than the hum of the engines, louder than the murmurs of passengers scrolling through their phones, louder than the racing thoughts she couldn't seem to control. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She had spent nearly 10 years with this airline. She had been strict, yes, but she had always followed the rules. First-class seats were premium, meant for paying customers, meant for people who belonged. Was it really so wrong that she had questioned it? But no matter how much she tried to justify it, the facts remained the same. She hadn't questioned anyone else. She hadn't even looked at Margaret's ticket before assuming she was in the wrong seat. She had embarrassed a woman. Publicly, loudly, without giving her the basic respect she would have given any other first-class passenger. And now, she was paying for it. She swallowed the lump in her throat, gripping the armrest as turbulence shook the plane slightly. Normally she would have reassured passengers, walked through the aisle making sure everyone felt secure. But now, she was just another passenger, gripping the seat, waiting for the landing. Margaret sipped the tea Tyler had brought her, her movements slow and deliberate. She wasn't one to gloat. She wasn't someone who found satisfaction in watching another person's downfall, but she was someone who believed in consequences. Isabel murmured from across the aisle, "Mrs. Lane, you might want to check this." Margaret adjusted her glasses as Isabel turned her phone toward her. The airline had just issued another statement. This one, more serious than before. "We are conducting an internal review to ensure all passengers are treated with fairness and respect. Effective immediately, the flight attendant involved in the incident has been placed on indefinite suspension pending investigation." Isabel smirked. Indefinite suspension. That's corporate talk for, we're waiting until people forget so we can quietly fire her. Margaret exhaled softly. "I never wanted to cost someone their job." Isabel scoffed. "Mrs. Lane, you didn't cost her anything. She did this to herself." Margaret said nothing, but deep down, she knew Isabel was right. Just then Tyler walked up, his expression unreadable. The flight wasn't over yet. But for Vanessa Reed, her career might be. Tyler adjusted his tie before turning to Margaret. "I just got word from the captain," he said quietly. "When we land, airline security will be meeting us at the gate." Margaret frowned slightly. "For what purpose?" Tyler hesitated, glancing toward Vanessa, who sat frozen in economy. "They'll be escorting Miss Reed to corporate offices for a formal hearing." Isabel leaned back, raising an eyebrow. "So they're not wasting any time." Tyler shook his head. Not when it's already in the public eye. Margaret pursed her lips, shifting in her seat. This situation had taken on a life of its own, far beyond what she had expected. She hadn't asked for this to become a spectacle, but that's exactly what it had become. Vanessa's stomach twisted as she saw Tyler speaking with Margaret. She didn't need to hear the conversation. She knew exactly what was being discussed. She wasn't stupid. Her career was slipping further through her fingers with every passing minute. Then, as if things couldn't get worse, another notification appeared on her phone. Missed call. Airline HR department. Her breath hitched. They weren't even waiting until she landed. She stared at the phone, hesitating before finally clicking on the voicemail. Miss Reed, this is Diane Mercer from Human Resources. We need to speak with you immediately upon landing. Please check in with your supervisor at the gate. We are also notifying your union representative regarding your suspension. Vanessa's entire body went cold. This wasn't just a slap on the wrist. This wasn't just an investigation. This was termination-level action. She glanced around, trying to keep her breathing steady. But she could feel it. Passengers were still watching her, judgment hanging in the air. She turned her head and locked eyes with William Carter, the older gentleman who had called her out earlier. To her surprise, he didn't look smug. He simply shook his head, as if to say, "You did this to yourself." Vanessa turned away, pressing her fingers against her forehead. For the first time since stepping onto this plane, she felt something new. Fear. The plane began its descent, and Margaret fastened her seatbelt as the captain's voice came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our final approach. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and tray tables secured. We'll be landing shortly. Isabel stretched her arms slightly, her eyes flickering toward Margaret. Are you ready for the circus waiting at the gate? Margaret sighed. I didn't ask for a circus. Isabel smirked. Well, you got one anyway. Margaret stared out the window, watching as the city below came into view. She had spent her whole life moving with grace, handling things quietly, never making a fuss. But today, the world had forced her into the spotlight, and for Vanessa Reed, her long fall from power was about to hit the ground. The plane descended smoothly, but inside the cabin, tension gripped the air like an unseen force. The usual excitement passengers felt when landing was missing. Instead, there was an unspoken anticipation, a silent understanding that something was about to unfold the moment those wheels touched the ground. Vanessa clenched the armrest, her fingers dug into the fabric as she swallowed against the tightness in her throat. The notification from Human Resources felt like a ticking clock, counting down to the inevitable. The airline had already made its decision. She wasn't an employee in waiting. She was a liability. One they needed to eliminate. Her heart pounded as she thought about what was waiting for her at the gate. Would they pull her into an office? Make her sign paperwork? Would they humiliate her further by walking her through the airport with security at her side? The thought sent a fresh wave of nausea through her. She had worked too hard, for too many years. To go out like this. She gritted her teeth, willing herself to think. She had to come up with a way to fight this. To convince them this wasn't worth firing her over. But how? She had always relied on rules, on policy, on the authority her position gave her. But now, those things had been ripped away. She was just another employee under review. Disposable. Margaret adjusted her seatbelt, her fingers brushing over the gold wedding band she still wore after all these years. She had kept quiet for most of the flight, letting things play out the way they needed to. But deep down, she wasn't sure how she felt about what was about to happen. She had never wanted a spectacle. She had never wanted revenge, but she had also never wanted to be humiliated in front of strangers, treated like a problem that needed to be removed. She sighed softly, glancing at Isabel, who was still glued to her phone. Isabel tilted the screen toward her. I hope you're ready to be on the news tonight. Margaret's brow furrowed. What do you mean? Isabel smirked. Someone in the airport already leaked that security is meeting this flight at the gate. Margaret exhaled. Whatever happened next, the world would be watching, and for Vanessa Reed, there was no escaping it now. Isabel's eyes flickered with amusement as she scrolled through her phone. Corporate is meeting this flight. Journalists are going to be waiting at the terminal. Margaret exhaled, shaking her head. This is getting out of control. Isabel crossed her legs. No, this is what happens when people don't just accept things anymore. Tyler, who had been standing near the galley, cleared his throat as he approached them. Mrs. Lane, I just wanted to thank you for your patience through all of this. I know it hasn't been easy. Margaret smiled gently. I appreciate that, young man. Tyler hesitated before speaking again. I also wanted to let you know, Captain Hayes was pretty upset about what happened. He's going to be filing his own report once we land. Margaret lifted a brow. Is that so? Tyler nodded. He doesn't tolerate crew members who mistreat passengers. He told me himself that this is the kind of incident that makes the airline look bad, not just because of what happened, but because it was preventable. Isabel chuckled. Translation: Vanessa just made his job harder, and now he's making sure she pays for it. Tyler sighed. Something like that. Margaret simply nodded. She had never been the type to demand consequences, but she believed in accountability. And for the first time, it seemed like it was actually happening. The intercom crackled as Captain Hayes' voice filled the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, we have now arrived at our destination. Please remain seated until we reach the gate and the seatbelt sign is turned off. On behalf of the crew, thank you for flying with us today. The plane taxied toward the terminal, and Vanessa felt like she couldn't breathe. She could see it now, through the tiny window. The flashing lights of airport security waiting near the jet bridge. Beyond them, a small crowd, people standing just outside the glass walls. Cameras already lifted, reporters murmuring into microphones. She was about to walk into a public relations disaster. Her mouth went dry. Up in first class, passengers exchanged glances, some adjusting their posture, as if they too were preparing for something unusual. Isabel nudged Margaret lightly. Ready to step off this plane as a legend? Margaret sighed. I just want to step off as a person who got to sit in her seat. Isabel grinned. Well, too late for that. The seatbelt sign dinged off, and just like that, everything was in motion. Vanessa sat frozen. As Tyler's voice rang through the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our destination. We ask that all passengers deplane in an orderly fashion. First-class passengers may disembark first. The first-class cabin stood immediately. Not in a rush, but with purpose. Margaret stood gracefully, lifting her purse onto her shoulder. Tyler stepped forward, offering to assist with her carry-on. She waved him off with a warm smile. She didn't need anyone escorting her anywhere. She had walked through life on her own 2 feet, and today would be no different. As she stepped toward the aisle, something unexpected happened. William Carter, the businessman who had called Vanessa out earlier, turned to her and gave a small nod of respect. A woman in oversized sunglasses, who had stayed silent the entire flight, leaned in and whispered, I'm sorry you had to go through that. Passengers who had sat quietly the entire flight now looked at Margaret with acknowledgement, as if realizing they had witnessed something they shouldn't have ignored. But Margaret didn't hold it against them. She knew. Change never started with a crowd. It started with one voice that refused to be silenced. She gave them all a gentle nod before moving toward the front of the plane. And as she stepped through the doorway, she felt it. The heat of flashing lights, the weight of cameras waiting just outside the gate. She was no longer just a passenger. She was the moment. Behind her, Vanessa remained frozen in her seat, her hands gripping the armrest. As she watched Margaret disappear down the jet bridge, she wanted to run, she wanted to hide. But there was no escaping this. The world was waiting for her too. And this time, she wasn't the one giving orders. She was the one being summoned. Vanessa's breath felt shallow as she watched the passengers leave, each one stepping past her, without a glance, without a second thought. She wasn't part of their world anymore. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the seat in front of her. She wasn't ready to face what was waiting beyond the plane door. She knew. The moment she stepped into the terminal, her life as she knew it would be over. The curtain separating first class from economy had been left open, and from where she sat, Vanessa could see Tyler standing near the exit, making sure passengers were disembarking smoothly. He didn't acknowledge her, didn't look in her direction. But she knew. He was aware she was still there. The aisle was emptying fast, and soon she'd have no choice but to get up. She turned her phone over in her hands, debating, Maybe corporate had sent another email. Maybe. There was still some way to fix this. Deep down, Vanessa knew. There was no fixing this. She had spent years controlling the space around her, dictating how things should run, making quick judgments, enforcing rules. But now, for the first time, she was at the mercy of someone else's decision, and it terrified her. A voice broke through her spiraling thoughts. Miss Reed. She flinched slightly and looked up. Tyler stood a few feet away, arms crossed, expression unreadable. You need to deplane. Vanessa hesitated. Her voice was smaller than she wanted it to be. Are they waiting for me? Tyler didn't sugarcoat it. Yes. Her stomach twisted. She gripped the armrest, but her body refused to move. Tyler sighed and stepped closer. Look, I don't know what's going to happen when you step off this plane. His voice was firm, but I do know you're making it worse by sitting here, like you're the victim. Vanessa's head snapped up. I am a victim. This is all happening too fast. One mistake shouldn't cost me my career. Tyler stared at her for a long moment, then exhaled through his nose. One mistake? He let out a humorless chuckle. Vanessa, you didn't just misread a ticket. You didn't forget to serve a drink. You humiliated a passenger for no reason. You made an assumption, and you doubled down on it, even when she gave you proof. Vanessa clenched her jaw. I didn't mean for it to go this far. Tyler's voice didn't waver, but it did. His words cut through her like a blade. And now, you're dealing with the consequences. She hated how simple he made it sound, how he acted as if everything was black and white. But the truth was, the world had turned against her in a matter of hours. She inhaled sharply, forcing herself to stand. Her legs felt unsteady as she reached for her bag. Tyler stepped aside, giving her space to move toward the exit. The closer she got to the front, the more suffocated she felt. She could hear voices now. Beyond the door, in the terminal, the distant clicking of cameras. She hesitated at the threshold. Tyler, he looked at her, waiting. Her throat felt dry. She wasn't sure what she wanted to say. Maybe an excuse, maybe an explanation, maybe just a chance to make all of this disappear. But there was nothing left to say. Tyler held her gaze for a moment, then simply said, Good luck. Vanessa stepped off the plane. She barely had time to adjust to the brightness of the terminal before she was met with flashing lights, murmurs, the weight of dozens of eyes locked onto her. A cluster of reporters stood near the gate, microphones in hand. Some were already speaking into cameras, recapping the incident for the evening news. Airport security stood nearby, clearly instructed to escort her the moment she stepped out. And just a few feet away, surrounded by curious passengers and journalists, stood Margaret Lane. Vanessa's breath hitched. Margaret wasn't speaking to anyone, wasn't entertaining the chaos around her. She simply stood, her posture straight, her face calm. And then, she turned, meeting Vanessa's gaze. Vanessa felt frozen in place. She expected anger, maybe satisfaction, maybe even amusement. But Margaret's expression was unreadable. For the first time, Vanessa didn't know what came next. Because for the first time, she wasn't in control. The terminal was a storm of flashing lights, murmured conversations, the quiet hum of phones recording, capturing the moment from every angle. Vanessa's chest tightened as the full weight of the situation pressed down on her. She had thought the plane was suffocating, but this was far worse. She could feel the cameras locked onto her, the reporters edging closer, waiting for her to react. She wanted to turn around, to step back onto the plane, to disappear, but there was no escape now. Airport security moved first. 2 uniformed officers stepped forward. One gestured toward her bag. The other nodded toward the private corridor leading away from the main terminal. Miss Reed, we need you to come with us. Her mouth went dry, but she nodded stiffly. She wasn't under arrest. She knew that much. But being escorted like this, in front of cameras, in front of passengers who had once seen her as an authority figure, was humiliating in a way she had never experienced before. Then, Margaret took a step forward. Vanessa's breath caught. Their eyes met again, and in Margaret's face, there was no anger, no satisfaction, just quiet observation, the kind that made Vanessa feel even smaller than she already did. For a brief second, Vanessa felt the urge to say something, to defend herself, to explain, to plead for some kind of understanding. But what could she say? That it was just a mistake? That she hadn't meant for it to go this far? That she wasn't a bad person? None of it would erase what had happened. None of it would change the fact that she'd humiliated Margaret, dismissed her, treated her like she didn't belong. And none of it would save her now. The world had already decided she was guilty. The cameras shifted their focus, now capturing both women in the same frame. Two people, on opposite ends of the same story. Behind Margaret, Isabel muttered under her breath. Well, this is poetic. Vanessa swallowed, forced herself to move. As security guided her toward the corridor, she kept her gaze forward, ignoring the voices, the clicks of cameras, the silent judgment radiating from the passengers who had just witnessed her downfall. Just as she was about to disappear from view, Margaret spoke. Her voice wasn't loud, wasn't angry, it was steady. Miss Reed. Vanessa froze. Mid-step, her fingers tightened around the strap of her bag. She turned slowly, meeting the gaze of the woman she had tried to remove from that plane. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Margaret simply said, I hope you learn from this. No venom, no gloating, just a statement, a truth that cut deeper than anything Vanessa had expected. Because the reality was, this moment would pass. The world would move on, the internet would find a new scandal. But Vanessa Reed would have to live with this forever. And as she stepped into the private corridor, away from the eyes of the world, she knew this wasn't just the end of her job. It was the end of who she used to be. The door shut behind Vanessa, with a soft but final click, sealing her off from the cameras, the whispers, the silent stares that had followed her since the plane landed. She exhaled sharply, her chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. The corridor was stark, cold, devoid of the chaos she had just stepped out of, but it offered no comfort, no escape. Two security personnel flanked her, leading her through a quiet hallway toward a small, windowless office. The kind of room that wasn't meant for meetings, but for decisions. Final ones. Vanessa's footsteps echoed softly against the tiled floor. The silence was unbearable. She wanted to speak, to ask what was going to happen next, to salvage what little dignity she had left. But the words felt useless now. When they reached the office, one of the guards opened the door. Gestured inside. Please have a seat, Miss Reed. She hesitated, gripping the strap of her bag tightly. Before stepping in, the office was small, clinical. A single desk, 2 chairs, a landline phone sitting untouched, no decoration, no warmth, just a room where bad news was delivered. Vanessa sat down, her back stiff, her pulse hammering in her ears. Then, the door opened again. A man in a dark navy suit stepped inside, his expression unreadable. Robert Whitmore, Senior Director of Airline Compliance. Vanessa had seen him before, mostly in corporate meetings, addressing policy updates and PR concerns, but she had never imagined she'd be sitting across from him like this. He took the seat opposite her, adjusting his cuffs before setting down a manila folder. The folder had her name on it. Vanessa swallowed. Robert clasped his hands together, met her gaze. Miss Reed, do you understand why you're here? She nodded stiffly. Because of what happened on the flight. Robert didn't respond right away. Instead, he opened the folder, scanned the top document, before speaking again. Because of what happened on the flight. His voice was calm, and because of the way the public has responded to it. Her stomach twisted. There it was. It wasn't just about what she had done. It was about who had seen it. Robert leaned forward slightly. We've conducted a preliminary review of the incident, and I want to be very clear with you, Miss Reed. This situation has escalated far beyond just a passenger complaint. Vanessa's nails dug into her palms. The video of your interaction with Mrs. Lane has been viewed over 2 million times as of this morning. Her breath hitched. News outlets have already picked it up. We've had over 800 customer complaints filed against you in the last 6 hours. Vanessa gritted her teeth. I didn't mean, Robert held up a hand, cutting her off. Miss Reed, intent is irrelevant. This is about perception. This is about what the world saw. Vanessa sat rigid, forcing herself to keep her expression neutral. Robert continued, flipping to another document. Furthermore, we've reviewed your past flight reports. Vanessa's pulse jumped. And while there are no official complaints against you, we did find multiple instances of passenger discomfort due to your strict enforcement of seating assignments. Her stomach dropped. A pattern that raises concern. Vanessa clenched her fists, her breath shallow. This was worse than she had expected. This wasn't just about one mistake. They were digging deeper, unraveling everything, and for the first time, She understood. This wasn't a meeting. This was a verdict, a sentencing, and the decision had already been made. Vanessa's pulse jumped. That's my job, she snapped. I enforce policies. Robert's gaze sharpened. And do you enforce them equally? Vanessa froze. The question hung in the air, heavy, suffocating. Robert let the silence stretch before sighing, before closing the folder. Then, here's where we stand. Her stomach plummeted. The airline has made its decision. Vanessa swallowed hard. Here it comes. Effective immediately. Your employment with the airline is terminated. The words landed like a hammer. She blinked. Her breath hitched. You're firing me? Robert nodded. We are terminating your employment on the grounds of misconduct, reputational damage to the airline, and failure to adhere to company values regarding customer treatment. Vanessa's hands clenched. This is ridiculous. I've worked here for 10 years. I followed protocol. Robert's expression didn't waver. No, Miss Reed. You followed your assumptions. The silence was unbearable. Then Robert reached into the folder, slid a document toward her. This is your official termination paperwork. We've already processed your severance package. You'll receive your final paycheck in 2 weeks. Vanessa stared at the paper. Her vision blurred. This was real. This was happening. Robert folded his hands. You have the option to appeal, but given the public nature of this incident, I strongly suggest you consider whether dragging this process out will serve you any benefit. Vanessa's mouth went dry. She understood the message. He was telling her to walk away. Not just from the job, from the fight. She forced a slow breath. Her mind scrambled for something, anything, that could change this. But there was nothing. She had lost. Robert stood, buttoned his suit jacket. Security will escort you to collect your belongings. Your employee access has already been revoked. And just like that, it was over. Vanessa didn't speak, didn't move. She just sat there, staring at the paper in front of her, as the last piece of her career slipped away. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, she picked up the pen, signed her name. When she set the pen down, her hands were steady, but everything else inside her was unraveling. Robert nodded, took the document. You're free to go, Miss Reed. Security stepped forward, waiting. Vanessa exhaled shakily. Then, for the last time, she stood up. As a flight attendant, she walked toward the door, her steps slow, her body numb, and as she stepped out of the office, past the security team, past the uniformed employees who wouldn't even meet her eyes, she knew there would be no coming back from this. Margaret Lane stepped into a waiting car. She glanced out the window, watching the flashes of cameras still lingering at the terminal. She had never asked for attention, never sought out a spectacle. But now, she was part of a conversation much bigger than herself. She sighed softly, looking out at the city beyond the airport. She had fought so many silent battles in her life. And today, for once, the world had actually listened. The sun had started to set, casting a golden hue over the city skyline as Margaret Lane sat quietly in the back seat of the car. The airport terminal grew smaller in the distance, but the weight of the day lingered. She had never sought the spotlight, never wanted to be the center of a viral moment. All she had wanted was to sit in the seat she paid for. She glanced down at her hands, tracing the soft wrinkles along her fingers. The world had changed since she was young, but some battles still had to be fought, no matter how many years had passed. For once, she didn't have to fight this one alone. The world had seen, and this time, the world had spoken. A soft vibration in her purse pulled her from her thoughts. A message from her granddaughter. Amara, Grandma, I saw what happened. I'm so proud of you. I love you. Margaret smiled, warmth settling in her chest. I love you too, sweetheart. And with that, she put her phone away and let the moment pass like all the others before it. Because for Margaret Lane, this had never been about making a scene. It had been about being seen. And finally, after all these years, she was. Vanessa Reed stepped through the side exit of the corporate office, a single duffel bag slung over her shoulder. She had been escorted out the back, away from the cameras, away from the crowds, away from everything she had spent the last 10 years building. Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone, hesitating before turning it on. She already knew what she'd find. Headlines, comments, a reputation that had shattered overnight. She inhaled sharply, shoving the phone deep into her pocket. This was it. The end of the career she had once been so proud of. And yet, Somewhere deep inside, she couldn't ignore the gnawing truth. She had done this to herself. The airline had made its decision, the world had watched, and now she would have to live with it. Forever. With her head down, Vanessa walked toward the parking lot. No cameras, no reporters, no power. Just a long, empty road ahead. And for the first time in her life, she had no idea where it would lead. This wasn't just about a seat. It was about who gets questioned, who gets ignored, who gets dismissed, and who gets believed. The world had watched, and this time, it hadn't looked away. If this story resonated with you, hit the like button. What are your thoughts? Should the airline have handled this differently? Drop a comment below. Subscribe for more stories that challenge, inspire, and make you think. And don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a video. Thank you for watching.